Hello, welcome to Simony Sectores. What is a hypothesis? A lot of people talk about hypotheses. They think it's merely theory creation. That is true from a scientific point of view, but that's not enough. Okay, logically speaking, what is a hypothesis? Let's say from Boetius and Aristotle, the Stoics, and so on. They have what's called hypotheticals. Now, a hypothetical is also known as a conditional. What that means is if this is true, then that is true, if this, or if A, then B. Because the whole entire idea is you have at the start of this, if A, the antecedent, then B, the consequent. So the consequence of A being true actually implies that B is true, and so there you have a propositional type, which is the idea of a hypothetical. Now, hypothesis is another thing about this. So when you're looking at the two different questions in Greek, or the two different main types of questions in Greek philosophy and dialectic, you have the thesis and the hypothesis. Now there are other different sources. Aristotle talks about the thesis as particularly important um, in his works. In uh, he talks about some thesis statements, which is closer to our modern idea of a thesis. But in general, when you're looking at hypothesis versus thesis, Boethius should be who we should look at. He makes a distinction that a hypothesis is a question of the particular. The thesis is the question of the general. So, what is justice? For example, is the thesis. You answer, justice is making sure that everyone's taken care of, or justice is equality. But you have to realize other theories are there too. Justice is something of retribution, whatever. And you debate these things. Now, how do you debate them? You rely on hypotheses. Yes, the theory that justice is whatever can be posited, but give me some particulars. So then you ask, okay, well, this man, did he act justly by doing that? And if he did act justly, then what? You see, when you're doing a hypothesis, you're playing from the antecedent to the consequent. Now, from a broad point of view, you could even say that a hypothesis, which will go to theory making, is a type of opinion which explains things, which is the modern idea of a hypothesis. Now, this existed also in the ancient world. They were called principles, and you take the first principle, which you cannot really explain, but they seem to explain everything else, and you get what a particular philosophical science was about from its first principles. Or in German terms, well, I'm not going to speak German, but the fundamental principle from Fichte is science of knowledge. Now, when you have a hypothesis, the theory will be created. If this is true, then that is true. The antecedent will always imply some sort of consequence. The consequence is usually up for debate. So a hypothesis itself may not be true because the antecedent has to be true in order for the hypothesis to be true. Except for if we're talking about it logically, because if I say if A is true, then B is true, well, if my interpretation that of A is right, then B must be right from it. But at the same time, the consequent may not actually follow from it, and that's and why the rules of logic are important. Now, more about the hypothesis. When you look at abductive reasoning, the indoxa, the reputable opinion, is what we have to introduce here. Now, abduction and hypothesis creation are often synonymous, and you take the credible idea. The credible theory I've talked about a little bit on this channel. You do not know if it's true, but it seems plausible. So you accept the idea until you learn more. And so you take the theory from these reputable opinions and you conclude from them. Then you gather facts, you use dialectic, you do induction, and from that point of time, you get the general idea, and from the general idea, you get the ability to demonstrate something that is necessary that follows. Of course, you need the middle term, and you have to have the general idea to get the middle term. Because if you do not get the general idea, then how do you know if your middle term actually is correct? And that's why a lot of the logicians in the medieval times mentioned induction as testing the deduction, but really induction and dialectic just also test the abductions, the abductive reasoning, the apagoge. So when you look at a modern science book, when it comes to the idea of the scientific method, a hypothesis can also be a theory. This theory is one that would enable us to find new facts. I'm not going to dispute that because I think actually this gives us a very interesting angle. So, from a philosophical standpoint, I have this theory. This theory produces new knowledge and also new facts. So, when I'm positing something, let's say I say that the theory of forms is correct, and I posit the theory of forms, then what do I learn from the theory of forms? That there's the intellectual side as well as the physical side. And so you have a duality that kind of goes on. Or I could even posit from that there is no material side, which would of course go against what we know of Plato, because he talks about things like the body being something that kind of holds us back from like the true knowledge of all things in Phaedo. Or you might get the theory of the soul. And from this theory, a lot more theories can be created, which are explained by the theory of forms. Now, of course, you may disagree with what I just said. That's fine. Let me know. That was just an example. I don't. So, like, another thing is, what if your theory is that there's no reality? Well, hypotheses themselves, there's a problem with just accepting hypotheses themselves. They need something to test them. And if there's no reality, no truth, or whatever, for one, you wouldn't have science if there's no truth, because you kind of need to have knowledge which you can learn and rely on. On reality, it's a category. I would not say whether or not the existence is a predicate. That's been a disputation for a while. But you have to at least assume that there is a reality in order to have a hypothesis. Because if there was no reality, all is theory. And theory produces knowledge. But Knowledge of what? I don't know. So the theory must have something to test it. And so by testing the theory with reality or with different opinions, trying to get at reality. And, by the way, I'm not a uh, absolute realist in the sense that I just do not. I believe there's reality, but I don't know if we can really know exactly. But we don't have anything to go on if there's nothing there. Our hypotheses would just be pure conjecture. And if they're pure conjecture, then what can we know? So, taking this as a fact, we can say that there must be that the idea that there is no reality is not very probable, because you cannot have a world where there is reality and knowledge. And if there's no knowledge, there's no reality, and therefore, since there is knowledge which we can gain through dialectic, through scientific method, through hypothesis creation, induction, logic, and so on, we would have to conclude that there is indeed a reality. But still, it's difficult to know what that reality is, which we share, and so on, from a true sense. But that's just a hypothesis. Like, comment, subscribe.